This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Forget the frustration of picking commerce platforms when you switch your business to Shopify, the global commerce platform that supercharges your selling wherever you sell. With Shopify, you'll harness the same intuitive features, trusted apps, and powerful analytics used by the world's leading brands. Sign up today for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/tech, all lowercase. That's shopify.com/tech.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Visit progressive.com to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary, not available in all states or situations.
We're already in the golden age of cybercrime, and we sort of have been for probably 15 to 20 years. And, governments have not found a way to disrupt it.
I'm Arthur Snell, and this is the Disorder Podcast, where we try to make sense of our mad, 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 mad world. This episode is part of our ongoing partnership with RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute think tank, and I'm delighted to be talking this week to Jamie MacColl about ransomware. We're going to talk about the way ransomware has become a real national security threat and how it links in with the activities of hostile and disordering states, particularly Russia, Iran, and North Korea, and also about how the West should try to disrupt the organized criminals that operate in the ransomware space. So my guest today, Jamie MacColl, is a research fellow in cyber and tech at RUSI, and he focuses on the national security implications of cybercrime, including the relationships between hostile states and cybercriminals. He's given evidence on ransomware on more than one occasion to the Joint Committee on National Security Strategy, and he also represents RUSI at the Counter Ransomware Initiative, which is a multilateral grouping of more than 80 countries. And when he's not working on cybercrime, he's a guitarist in the British band Bombay Bicycle Club, so check that out if you can. Jamie, welcome. Great to have you with us. Ransomware is a big focus of your work. Let's just start with a quick description of what it is, and perhaps you can give a recent example of how it has emerged into the sort of public arena.
So I guess in the broadest definition, ransomware is a form of cyber extortion, which typically either encrypts or steals a victim's data in order to obtain a ransom payment, usually in cryptocurrency. The most impactful example I can think of the last few years, maybe I'll do one in the US and one here. So sure. In 2001, a Russian-speaking ransomware group called DarkSide gained access to a company in the US called Colonial Pipeline, which controls an oil pipeline on the East Coast that supplies about 40 to 50% of all fuel consumed on the East Coast. And they did this through using credentials that they'd bought on the dark web. They encrypted Colonial's IT systems and demanded a $4.5 million ransom to decrypt them. As a precaution, Colonial shut down the pipeline for 6 days, which caused fuel shortages and panic buying across the East Coast as petrol stations were closed. And Colonial did pay the ransom, although the decryptor did not work properly. And this was one of the first times, particularly in the US, ransomware was really sort of considered as a kind of national security issue because it struck at the heart of something that is important to the American public, which is essentially access to fuel to drive your car.
Yes.
And I think it was the first time you saw a administration there think, why is this happening to us? Why is it so easy for, Russia-based cyber criminals to do this to our critical national infrastructure? And why are there seemingly so few consequences for it?
Yeah.
And then I think the UK example, that I would focus on is an incident that affected Synnovis last year, which is a provider of pathology services to several NHS trusts in London. And this was committed by, again, a Russian-speaking ransomware group called Qilin that ended up causing severe delays to several NHS trusts. I think led to more than 2,000 operations being cancelled, emergency care being disrupted, shortages of blood stocks. So really kind of caused cascading effects that went across the healthcare system, not only in London, but nationally.
So one of the things I'm interested to ask is a sort of procedural point, which is these people are hacking and encrypting the data of other organizations. I mean, is that easy to do? Because it's, in a way, what we're talking about is how this has become a widespread crisis. So is there something about this that makes it easy to do?
It's easy to do now. It wasn't sort of 15 to 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And it's easy to do now, and the barriers of entry to low because there is an ecosystem that has sprung up around it that provides lots of different tools as a service.
Right.
So whether that's gaining access to victims as a service, so people that specialize in, as I said with the Colonial Pipeline, obtaining credentials and selling them, gaining access to victims and selling them to other criminals, or selling the ransomware itself as a service. So essentially there'll be developers that make the ransomware, make the infrastructure that hosts the negotiations with victims, and then sell that to other criminals who all they have to do essentially is to get onto the victim's network and then deploy the ransomware. And it's actually developing the ransomware in particular that technically is the challenging part of it, because it involves, in some cases, quite advanced cryptography.
Right. But in a way, it sounds like you're describing something that, if we were to take away the criminality of it, is a fairly high-functioning, sort of market-driven, innovation-led industry that is constantly innovating and there are different players and they're all able to provide sort of services to one another.
Yeah, I think the sort of core operating model has not changed that much over the last 7 to 8 years, and it hasn't had to because it's been so profitable.
Yeah.
And we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars or even billions for single, that's kind of cybercriminal groups, although group is not necessarily the right word to describe them. So there are small innovations that happen within that ecosystem, but the sort of core business model has not had to change because governments have not found a way to disrupt it.
Yeah. So you've touched on it there. So let's talk about the scale of this problem. Inevitably, we don't tend to hear about these attacks unless they hit something very high profile or possibly something with a sort of public service remit. But what's your sense of how widespread it is, and perhaps what the costs are, both to businesses and to wider society?
I mean, the short answer is we just don't know how widespread it is because there is no mandatory reporting for ransomware incidents anywhere in the world, although the UK government is considering introducing a mandatory reporting regime. And similarly, victims are not incentivized to be transparent about it because of the reputational costs associated with it. But I think in the UK, we're probably looking at around 1,000 a year, and the majority of those will never come to light. The UK National Cybersecurity Centre said that last year it responded to 13 nationally significant ransomware incidents, which it defines as something that had a serious impact on central government, essential services, a large proportion of the UK population or the UK economy. But I think we know about those. It's really the hundreds of them against kind of SMEs that get lost.
Yeah. And of course, the classic ransomware incident, as you described, the ransomware is deployed, a company is put under pressure, they pay the ransom, and so on. But there are cases where one assumes the ransom hasn't been paid and the data goes into sort of suspension. And I'm struck, and maybe some listeners to this podcast, given our sort of the nature of what we do, the British Library, it's not necessarily critical national infrastructure, but it's certainly pretty important. That's been out of commission for nearly half a year, hasn't it?
It's been a very long time. I think as a publicly funded organisation, they committed to not paying a ransom. Yeah. And I think the majority of victims don't pay ransoms, not just in the public sector, but the costs can be significant. And I think the British Library is an interesting case study, and I think a worrying one if you think about similar organisations, in that it's really a single point of failure in the UK society. There's no other institution that provides the kinds of services that it does.
Right.
And I think for researchers who rely on the British Library, it's put research projects on hold, it's put books on hold, and maybe not everyone will be, shedding a tear for academics not being able to finish their research projects. But I think it's not critical national infrastructure in the kind of traditional sense, but it, as I say, it provides a function that nothing else does in society. Yeah,
and in a way, that's what feels remarkable. Someone like me who doesn't have a technical knowledge, because it's a British Library, I sort of think, well, can't GCHQ step in and decrypt the file? But that isn't really an option, is it?
Occasionally, there are people that are able to develop decryptors, and often by kind of chance or luck. And there have also been cases where law enforcement has essentially compromised the criminal groups and then been able to obtain decryption keys for each victim and then send them to victims. But that's the exception rather than the rule. And then I think broadly, government is fairly powerless to stop it, and doesn't really have the resources to go in and do the sort of incident response on the vast majority of ransomware incidents in the UK, even for critical national infrastructure providers. And most of the time, the response will be privatized, even if it's a public sector body. They'll be going out to a private incident response company to come and do it, because government and law enforcement's capacity to do the kind of technical incident response is incredibly limited.
Yeah. And when you do that, if I'm not mistaken, the incident response in this sector is effectively sort of hostage negotiation, isn't it?
Well, that's one aspect of it. So some of it will be trying to boot the attackers out of systems, potentially rebuilding all the IT systems, which can, as you say, with the British Library case, can take months and years. But then one aspect of it, yes, is negotiating with the criminals, and they'll do that a lot of the times even if there isn't a desire to pay. So they'll see it as a way to obtain intelligence from the criminals, like how did they get in? Can they provide an example of a decryption key working on a single file? So it's a bit of a kind of proof of life negotiation, but for computer systems and data rather than a person. Yeah. So why has this got so prevalent? Is it just a simple case that it's easy and very, the return on investment is very high? Because I noticed what you said, that you thought that most people aren't paying ransom. So what's in it for the operators here? Well, let's say even if 90% of victims don't pay ransoms, if 10% and 1% of that 10% are paying a $50 million ransom, that's enormously profitable. And I think the single highest ransom I've heard was $75 million. So even if you have a criminal organization of 40 or 50 people, $75 million between those people is still very profitable. And why has it become so prevalent? So I think there were probably four kind of main drivers of it. There's systemic cyber insecurity. So it is too easy for them to gain access to victims. And there's lots of reasons why we have systemic cyber insecurity. There's the inherent challenges of doing cybersecurity, particularly as a smaller business. There's the fact that too many of our large technology vendors sell products that are not made with security in mind, and there's no kind of financial consequences for them doing that. And then we have kind of incentives that do push victims towards paying. I think, particularly in the US, there's a kind of business culture of we have to get back to business, we have to keep making money. That's the most important thing. And then you also have kind of things like privacy regulation, which I would argue do inadvertently push people towards paying, because if there's data on data subjects that's been stolen or affected, the victims think, if I pay a ransom, I'm going to mitigate some of my kind of regulatory requirements around sensitive data.
And on that point, is it correct that if, for example, I happen to have a database with lots of personal information, for listeners' purposes, I can assure you I don't, hypothetically, if that were hacked, I'm responsible because by definition that's evidence of my lack of cybersecurity.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then I think the other two drivers are, so the emergence of cryptocurrency.
Yeah.
And ransomware, I don't think explodes in the way it does without cryptocurrency. So as a means of collecting a large ransom payment outside of the financial system,
Yeah.
because that puts you outside of a lot of kind of anti-money laundering and sanctions checks. And it also allows them to launder it over borders without having to develop very sophisticated kind of money laundering operations. And then I think the fourth driver, and probably the most important one, is the fact that the majority of these criminals are based in Russia or the former Soviet Union and are implicitly or explicitly protected by the Russian state.
Yeah. So that leads us perfectly onto the next bit, because I want to talk about who's doing it. You talked in one case study of Qilin that did the NHS hack. What do we know about these people? Who are they? How do they operate? Do they have commanders? Do they have, talk a bit about the perpetrators.
So Qilin, we don't know anything about.
Okay. Talk about another one.
Yeah, we can talk about some other ones. And maybe talk about a few that all have sort of different operating or business models as groups.
Yeah.
And almost all of these case studies we know because Western law enforcement has compromised these groups and then sanctioned them.
Yeah.
So the first is the imaginatively titled Evil Corp.
Right. Run by Dr. Evil? Or?
Yeah. Which is a group of Russian cybercriminals who have a very long history in cybercrime in Russia that goes way back before ransomware. We're probably talking around 20 years now of doing different forms of cybercrime. And the leader of Evil Corp is a guy called Maxim Yakubets, who started developing banking Trojans in the late 2000s, which were rented out to other criminals. He got together with other Russian cybercriminals to do more of that kind of activity before moving into ransomware in 2017. And Evil Corp is interesting because it's a bit more like almost the mafia or a family in terms of how it operates. It's very close-knit. Yakubets brought in his father and brother and cousins to help with money laundering. The members go on holiday together. They socialize together. It's more like The Sopranos if it was set in Moscow in the mid-2010s.
Yeah.
And they also have a very close relationship with the Russian state and have conducted operations for the Russian state. And Yakubets, the leader, is also married to the daughter of an ex-senior FSB official, so a senior Russian intelligence official. So that's sort of one model. And then we have another group called Conti, which again was one of the most prolific ransomware groups up until 2022 when it sort of imploded. Conti operated more like a startup. So it had a nice Moscow office with salaried staff, an HR department that used sort of Russian headhunting services to find new members, and teams split up into different specialisms. So as I mentioned, HR had people that just did negotiations, people that essentially ran a call center to harass victims. So call up and said, why haven't you paid yet? Or to send threats, people whose sole purpose was to kind of develop the ransomware code. And that model allowed Conti to scale very quickly and sort of do hundreds, if not thousands, of ransomware attacks.
So they basically behaved like a legitimate cybersecurity company, except they were sort of in reverse.
And sometimes they would even, the ransom note that accompanied the ransomware would frame it in that way, which is we've exposed the vulnerabilities and weaknesses in your cybersecurity posture, so please pay us $5 million for this service that we've done for you.
Yeah. So you've talked about the Russian ones. The other country, if I'm not mistaken, that is significant here is North Korea. I'm guessing that they have a slightly different model. Can you say a bit about them?
Yeah, so I'd say each of the, I guess, inverted commas, big four, so Russia, North Korea, China, and Iran, have all been involved in ransomware in different ways. And each of the different ways they interact with it reflects their strategic culture and approach to statecraft. So North Korea, it's very much focused on revenue generation. So similar to the very big cryptocurrency heists that some people may be familiar with, it's designed to generate revenue for the state. And actually one of the first times ransomware came onto the kind of public consciousness in the UK was in 2017 when North Korea affected the NHS with the WannaCry ransomware, which was pretty significant for the NHS, sort of caused tens of millions of pounds worth of damage, and similar to the Synnovis attack, delayed operations, emergency care, that kind of thing. And then in China's case, it's using ransomware to kind of obfuscate their intelligence and espionage operations. So if they're inside a network of a defense contractor looking for IP to steal, they might deploy ransomware to confuse the defenders and to cover their tracks. And then Iran, it's sort of a bit of everything because Iran as a cyber actor is a bit all over the place. It's either using ransomware for geopolitical objectives. So in 2022, they caused very severe disruption using ransomware to the Albanian government, because at that time, the Albanian government was hosting an Iranian dissident group called MEK.
Oh, yes.
And this was a sort of punishment for that. And in that kind of case, they will use ransomware because they believe it gives them some sort of plausible deniability, although inevitably that doesn't work because actually there are pretty good forensic investigators that can uncover that.
You know, one of the really striking parts of this story, and we hear a lot about, is the links between the Russian actors and the state. And obviously you've already given that illustration of the sort of family link to the FSB. So I think, and obviously Russia is probably high on the list of imminent threats, as it were. Let's unpick this a bit. What exactly is that relationship? To what extent do these groups operate on the instructions of the state, or is it on the understanding of the state? How would we sort of interpret that activity?
So I think it's a spectrum of behavior. There are groups like Evil Corp, the one I mentioned already, where there are close personal relationships between the criminals and the state, and the criminals will carry out operations at the behest of Russian intelligence, and that could be for intelligence collection or something more destructive. And then there will also be examples where Russian intelligence, and particularly the GRU, uses ransomware. So essentially, buys access to ransomware from the dark web or from criminals, or develops their own and uses it for destructive purposes.
Yeah.
And they did that in 2017 with a ransomware attack called NotPetya, which I think still is the most financially costly ransomware attack of all time. And that was a ransomware that was meant to target Ukrainian organizations, but had a sort of worming capability, which meant that essentially it spread all around the world and affected Maersk, the shipping company, particularly badly. And then you also see examples where Russian intelligence has identified Russian criminals who have broken the law, and specifically maybe broken the law in Russia, so committed cybercriminal acts against Russian organizations. And then essentially they will be co-opted or told that they have to do things for the state in order to avoid being arrested or worse. The key thing for listeners to understand is that the vast majority of ransomware attacks are not directed by the Russian state. Mm-hmm. It's not the case of them saying, there's a Russian intelligence officer that tasks Qilin to target the NHS and Synnovis, a provider of pathology services in the NHS. They allow them to exist and to operate, but they're, for the most part, not directing their activities.
In a way, I mean, we've already touched on the sort of worst case scenarios. If you suspend or slow down the work of healthcare providers, clearly one can imagine the impact of that. But are there sort of scenarios that keep people like yourself, or perhaps your sort of analogous colleagues inside government, awake at night, and what might they be?
I mean, I think the worst case scenario normally is a ransomware attack against some part of the electrical grid, which causes sustained disruption. Yeah. And, as we've seen with the Heathrow incident, the UK is not necessarily a particularly resilient country in a lot of ways. And the thing that concerns me is, to be honest, less the technical aspects of an incident like that, and more just as a country, our ability to deal with inconvenience without people rushing to panic buy, and for even a small breakdown in societal order. Outside of that kind of thing, I think some people may remember the incident affecting CrowdStrike and Microsoft last year. So CrowdStrike is a supplier of antivirus and endpoint and detection response services. In July of last year, they sent out an accidental update which caused significant disruption to a lot of their customers, including a lot of airlines. The fix for that was relatively quick, but if you think about a scenario in which a criminal or a state gets access to the kind of back end of that kind of service, which is connected to huge numbers of important companies and services throughout the economy, and was able to send out a malicious update which didn't have an easy fix, that's the kind of scenario where you're looking at, sustained disruption to lots of different companies in a systemic way.
After the break, we're going to order the disorder. Jamie's got some really interesting ideas about how we can adjust our approach to ransomware.
Mega orderers. I'm guessing that you would enjoy to read the books of disorder guests like George Monbiot, Harvey Whitehouse, Julia Ebner, Brian Klaas, or Anne Applebaum. But who has the time to read all these books? You know what you should do? You should check out the New Books Network. It is the world's largest podcast network, which is book-focused. With over 150 podcasting channels covering an incredibly diverse range of topics. There's literally anything you can think of. I found myself listening to stuff about neoliberalism, and then Mexican-American studies, then Christian interpretations of the Old Testament. Amazing stuff. The way I look at it is that it is like a Wikipedia for audio, except that the contributors are all experts. And man, do I love me some experts. So if you love experts, you should search for the New Books Network on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or visit their website at newbooksnetwork.com and join their newsletter.
We've talked a lot about this problem and the scale of it. And the language we all use, we talk about cybercrime, we talk about it as a law enforcement issue, but it's clearly a crime that is completely out of control and is, that our normal law enforcement don't appear to have the resources to deal with. So this is the bit of the podcast we call Ordering the Disorder. And what you described is the way that ransomware is disordering both the online space, but actually the knock-on effects to the real world space. What are your ideas, and I know that you've done a lot of work on this, about how we might tackle this problem?
I mean, obviously the most important one would be to fix the systemic cyber insecurity and poor resilience that we have. But I don't see there being the political will to do that, because ultimately it requires really changing the incentives around technology, and in particular holding large technology vendors to account. The ICO does not issue a lot of fines, and when they do, they're pretty small. So the Information Commissioner's Office, which regulates data protection in the UK. If you look at the fine they issued against British Airways a few years ago for their poor security practices, that was £20 million.
And if I'm not mistaken, that was a colossal leak with sort of credit card numbers, three digits on the back, the whole gamut.
And that's a drop in the ocean for BA. And when you're in effect a monopoly on certain routes out of the UK, it's not going to make that much of a difference to what you do. But that's the people that buy cybersecurity services or buy technology. I'm also talking about the people that sell it, so the Microsofts of this world. Yes. And at the moment, and although the Biden administration did look at creating a software liability regime, which would essentially have put financial liabilities onto companies that make insecure software, that's gone nowhere and is unlikely to go anywhere, particularly under the Trump administration, given the relationship between a lot of the big tech companies and the new administration.
And that's interesting, isn't it? Because obviously, if I keep my stuff on a cloud, and no doubt the cloud tells me it's a secure system. I mean, Google doesn't say, beware, this is leaky as hell. They say, we've got layers of great encryption.
Well, yeah, you'd hope so. And the cloud, particularly for ransomware, like the cloud is more secure than having on-premise servers. It's easier to update. But so putting aside the sort of systemic and cyber insecurity, I think the one thing we've not really done or tried to do is change the cost-benefit analysis of the criminals. Yeah. We haven't changed their feeling of safety and risk in a way that we have in something like counterterrorism. And to be clear, I'm not suggesting that the UK or the US does drone strikes against ransomware operators in Russia, because I think
as attractive as it sounds,
I think there's
that will if we're going to disorder.
If we're going to go to war with Russia over something, I think it probably shouldn't be cybercrime as bad as it is. But I think there are other ways to do it, and we've started to see small indications of the law enforcement approach changing a bit. So when the National Crime Agency took down the Lockbit ransomware group in February of last year, and Lockbit at that point was the most prolific ransomware group, they didn't just take down the infrastructure, they did a sort of psychological operations aspect to it, where they leaked data on the group and in slow drips and drabs said, we know who you are, here's photos of you, we know where you are in Russia, we know the affiliates that have worked for you. And that kind of thing not only has a psychological impact, I think, on the criminals affected by it, but also breaks trust between the people selling the ransomware and the people operating it. Because if the people that are buying it from them can't trust that they're not being watched by law enforcement or the NSA or GCHQ, then they start to think, is this actually worth the risk?
Yeah.
But ultimately, I'm not convinced that it's law enforcement that are going to do that in an effective and sustained way, because their purpose is to reduce harm when they see it. And that doesn't lend itself to, say, sustained intelligence operations against a criminal group, where ultimately being effective may involve not even revealing that you're ever there. So it could be that you just sit inside their infrastructure, messing with it, essentially making their lives boring and dull because they're having to fix problems with their code all the time instead of being able to actually conduct ransomware operations. Or, maybe you do things like divert cryptocurrency payments that are meant to go between individuals within the group to destroy trust. So I think essentially it's a kind of intelligence-led approach to countering it rather than a law enforcement one.
Yeah. I mean, it is the IT equivalent of a drone strike to insert malware on their systems that actually just basically destroy their ability to operate. And of course, importantly, this is not, if this was the FSB, that would be a risky, one might argue is valid or not valid, but it would be risky. It's a state organization. We're talking about a private entity. The Russian state is never going to stand up and defend these people, are they?
No, I'm not sure I'm not sure deploying malware against them is necessarily the drone strike equivalent, because ultimately they can just rebuild. Yeah. Although I guess you could say that with our counter-terrorism strategy, often just they've rebuilt as well. So it's a bit whack-a-mole, but I think it's still better than the current approach, which is basically just to sort of wring our hands and say, oh, it's too difficult, they're protected by the Russian state, there's nothing we can do about it.
Is there a role for sanctions here, or are all these people sanctioned already and it's not stopping them from doing anything?
There are sanctions, but I think particularly in the UK, the bar to sanctioning them is quite high, and it often feels a little bit random of why have they sanctioned this ransomware group, but not this other one that's really prolific. And one of the downsides of sanctions is also that it can harm victims. So if it's stopping a victim from paying a ransom in a situation where you could argue it's actually important, if it stops a business from becoming bankrupt, or it's a critical national infrastructure provider that's providing an essential service, then you can make an ethical case in those scenarios that there's a reason to pay, and sanctions arguably can remove that option.
Yeah, that's a good point. So, Jamie, obviously in other contexts, the UK government is very down on the idea of paying ransoms. Most notably, we all know about sort of hostage scenarios. So how does the government look at the idea of paying ransom payments in this space, which has almost been normalised?
So the guidance has always been don't pay a ransom, but they've had no, I guess, leverage over victims up to this point. In January of this year, however, the government did launch a consultation on a set of legislative proposals for ransomware, including a partial payment ban, so which essentially would either criminalize or require victims that pay ransoms in certain sectors to pay a financial penalty. And that will affect, so the public sector and regulated critical national infrastructure sectors, of which I think there's about 13 in the UK. That will, if it goes ahead or if it's legislated, will be the first sort of ransomware specific payment ban in the world. Other countries have considered it. The US and Australia all have rejected it. So it's quite interesting that the UK is going down such an interventionist route, and I would say doesn't align more generally with how it approaches cybersecurity.
No. And the basic point here is that if you don't pay, there aren't many other options open to you. So what are you supposed to do? You obey the law, you don't pay, and you just say, well, sadly, I've lost my business.
Yeah, well, the assumption on the government's part is if we do this, these sectors will stop paying, and therefore the criminals will stop targeting them because they learn that they don't pay, and it will deter them. I think that is founded on a real misunderstanding of how ransomware operates and how the business model works. That it's not, they don't set out to target specific victims.
No.
It is a crime of opportunity.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty doubtful that your average ransomware operator is going to learn how the UK defines and regulates critical national infrastructure.
No. And this is where the analogy with not paying terrorists is very different, isn't it? Because in the end, a tiny number of people will be taken hostage, and they might well know that if you kidnap a Brit, you're more likely to meet the SAS than meet someone with lots of money, whereas this is working at a volume.
Possibly, but I think even with kidnap for ransom for terrorist financing, there is the global ban, but there are lots of countries that don't comply with it.
Yeah.
And actually, if you're kidnapping someone in the Sahel or in parts of the Arabian Peninsula, you're not necessarily going to know who you've kidnapped until after the fact. So it's only, which is an interesting comparison with ransomware, I think, because you don't learn that you captured a British person until afterwards, or if it's a French person where the government might be more likely to pay.
So I guess, we've talked a lot about the sort of the offensive measures, but in terms of ordering this as disorder, you've already talked about the responsibility of software companies, but is there more basic stuff? I mean, in terms of cyber education, there is a slight feeling that if you have and I'm not saying anything about my own tech awareness, but if you have a level of awareness, you feel like you're always being told really obvious things, like change your passwords. Well, I knew that already. I mean, obviously it's still important. But is there something that clearly an organisation like the NHS or Synnovis would have had a well-trained professional, probably IT security manager working with, and they still got done. So is there something they're missing at that level?
There's been so many awareness campaigns and there's loads of voluntary guidance.
Yeah.
And the majority of people now, I think, know that you should probably you should have different passwords and you should have, multi-factor authentication enabled. The difficult thing is if you, particularly as a smaller business, and I think Synnovis probably did count as a smaller business, despite its very critical role in the NHS, it is really expensive to employ dedicated cybersecurity staff. And actually, we need to think about ways that we can enable businesses, particularly smaller businesses, to be more secure without having a dedicated member of cybersecurity staff. When I buy an off-the-shelf product, I'm not picking on Microsoft, but just Office 365 because it's something that
the standard product.
Yeah, it's so prevalent. That should be, from the moment I unbox it, it should be secure by default.
Yeah.
I, as an end user, shouldn't have to do really complicated things to make it more secure. And that's the end point that we need to get to, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's like It's like buying a door without a lock, but you don't even know that there isn't a lock. I mean, that's the point, isn't it? A normal person can't be expected to review the security. But there must be also a duty on procurers, because again, I'm certainly not targeting Synnovis, I don't know anything about them, but if you're buying services from a company that in the end isn't able to secure data, a big entity like the NHS should be able to know whether or not that's an issue.
Yeah, I mean, and arguably in those kinds of cases, it should partly be on the NHS to pass those sort of requirements down the supply chain. So the NHS should not be working with any sort of supplier where if they go down, it has the chance to have a profound effect on their ability to deliver services.
So finally, we've talked completely relevantly, given where we're both from, about the UK quite a bit. But you alluded to the fact that clearly big tech has probably never had a higher influence in the US. And the other point feels worth observing, and you correct me if I'm wrong, is that there will be lots of countries where ordinary cybersecurity levels are probably lower than they are here. So are we actually on the dawn of a sort of golden age for cybercrime, given the combination of the power of big tech and actually the growth of tech worldwide and the fact that probably many people can either not afford or aren't fully aware of what risks they're taking?
I think we're already in the golden age of cybercrime, and we sort of have been for probably 15 to 20 years. Even as it is, the criminals find it so hard to monetize insecurity, whether that's through ransomware or fraud targeting individuals. And, if I was looking for opportunities in, Southeast Asia or West Africa and was financially insecure, it's a very easy route to go down.
Well, on that slightly sobering thought, Jamie, thank you very much for joining me today for the Disorder podcast.
Thank you, Arthur.
Thank you for joining this special RUSI Disorder podcast collaboration. As part of our work with RUSI, we hold live events at RUSI's wonderful headquarters in Whitehall. The next one's happening in May. So if you want to come along to that live event, subscribe to our Substack. The link's in the show notes, and that will give you access. So it just remains for me to thank my guest today, Jamie MacColl. Our producer was the one and only George McDonough. Our executive producer was Neil Fern. Thanks for listening. Goodbye.
Mega orderers, I need many podcasts these days. Not just to hear the rapid-fire news, but to break down how could all this be happening to us. And someone I turn to is Jordan Harbinger. His show was previously named one of Apple's best. We had him on episode 69, Life in North Korea, Kidnapping Stories, and Why Symbolism Matters with Dictators. And that pretty much tells you all you need to know about how the Jordan Harbinger show works. He has deep dive interviews dealing with things like psychology, self-help. He might talk to an FBI negotiator about trust. And he draws on some of our top table disorder guests like Anne Applebaum to think about why disorderers like Iran and Russia can work together. I'm sure you'll love it. So search The Jordan Harbinger Show wherever you get your podcasts.